find it really interesting how stories travel around. And the story I'm going to tell you now is a story that came from a very famous Scottish storyteller called Duncan Williamson. And he was told it by his uncle. But I don't know where he got the story from. What I do know is that Duncan told it to another dear friend of ours, storyteller, Taffy Thomas. And that's where I got it from. But I've also heard tell of a story similar around these parts. A long time ago when the Broads weren't there, because of course this land would have been covered in woods in the 11th century. And then when they got rid of all the woods, they started to dig the ground for peat. But we're very low-lying here. So as they dug the pits for the peat, the water would come and fill them up. So I think the peat business only happened for about 200 years. And then we were left with this magnificent landscape with all the Broads that we have around here. And this story, well, it could have taken place in How Hill or maybe at Horning. But somewhere there was a cottage next to a Broad. And in this cottage there lived a man called Bryn. And now this man lived alone. And this man had no human friends because this man was a hunchback. His back was as round as a hill. And that's what Bryn means, shaped like a hill. So he bent over, and his head was not shaped like other people's heads. It was bigger in comparison to his body. So Bryn found it quite difficult when he was faced with going into the village, which is how he made his money. He would gather up wood, sticks from the woods around the Broad, and he would go into the village and he would sell them. And the people, well, they weren't very nice to him. People are sometimes a bit funny with people who look a bit different. So they would quickly give him his money and want him to be gone. And the children, well, children could be quite cruel. They would chase after him and shout names at him. So he would be very happy to actually buy the things that he needed with the money that he made and then go back to the woods next to the Broad. Because there he had many, many friends. He had his friend the robin and the wren. He had the rabbits and the deer and the fox, and all of them would come and gather around him. The robin would sit on his shoulder and the wren would chirp in the trees. And even the rabbits and the fox, even though they are enemies normally, they would sit around his feet. And the deer would come and he would feed them. He would share whatever he had and give them. So he was not lonely. But one day they saw a swan fly overhead. And swans are so beautiful when they fly. Their big wings and their long necks. Not so graceful when they land. So all of them, the robin and Bryn, they went down to the Broad and they saw this swan, which was an unusual sight. But the swan stayed away from where they were, even though he tried to bring it forward with feeding it with some bread, and it would not come to him. But no matter. Bryn thought this swan had just arrived. Maybe it flown for a very, very long way. So every day he would go down to the Broad and he would sit on the side and he would see this beautiful swan with her S-shaped neck, because she was a mute swan. And Bryn, he was mute too. So he could not speak. He could hear, he could see, but he could not speak. So he felt some connection with this swan. And every day, no matter what the weather was, he would go down and he would watch and he would wait and he would walk as far as he could around the Broad. But as he walked, so the swan would go over the other side, and it seemed like he could never get close to her. And he called her the Lady of the Lake. Now this went on all the way from the spring through to the summer and through on into autumn. And then at the end of October, when the weather starts to get cold and the nights start to get darker and darker, one day Bryn didn't appear. And the animals were worried because he was there every day. And then another day went by, and the people in the village started to think, well, where is he? Not that they cared for him, but it was an inconvenience when they didn't bring the wood for them to use on their fires. And then another day went past, and by this time the animals were beside themselves. And Robin gathered everybody together and said, what has happened? What has happened to our friend Bryn? Why is he not coming? So they decided that they would seek counsel. And of course, the wisest person in the woods was the owl. So they all together, they went to the owl. And they called up to the owl and said, Owl, we need your help. Please, our friend Bryn, there is something wrong. He has not been coming to see us. And Owl looked down at them, and he knew it must be serious if all these animals were gathered here together. And so he thought long and hard, and he said, he has been watching the swan. And they said, yes, he's called her the Lady of the Lake. I think he maybe has a broken heart. I think he is in love with the swan. I think you must go and tell the swan to come and see him. But how can we do that? Robin, you must fly. You must fly to the swan. You must tell her. And that is what happened. They went back to Bryn's cottage. And Robin flew up to the window. And he looked through the window, and there was Bryn, lying so still and so pale, his skin pale against the white of his sheet. And Robin tapped really gently on the window, and he saw Bryn's body move, so he knew that he was alive. And then he flew off to the Broad, and he found the swan, and she was near the old willow where Bryn used to sit and wait for her. It was like she knew too that he had not been there. And the robin flew onto the branch, and he spoke to the swan and said, you must come to our friend Bryn. He loves you. He needs you. We need you. And with that, the swan swam over to the shore, and she started to waddle up to the cottage. And when she got there, it didn't take long for her to push the door open. And she walked over to the bed, and she tapped Bryn 3 times on his forehead. And Bryn opened his eyes just momentarily. And with that, the swan, she had a long, long neck, and she laid it across his body and around down his neck and over his shoulder. And Bryn, he put his arms around that swan, and they laid there. And all the animals are saying, what's happening? What's happening? Because Robin is looking through the window. And he said, oh, she's put her neck around his neck, and he's awake. No, he's closed his eyes, but he's holding her. And then Robin watched while the swan pulled herself up, and she pulled a feather out of her left wing, and she stuck it into the left breast of Bryn, and blood started to trickle down where she'd pushed it in so hard. And then she took a feather out of her right wing, and she pushed it into the right breast of Bryn, and again it bled. And then she did it again with feathers from her back, and she pushed them into his shoulders. And then before Robin's eyes, he watched as the hunchback became covered in white feathers. His neck grew long and sleek, and a beak came. And the animals are saying, "What's happening? What's happening, Robin?" And Robin said, "You..." And Robin couldn't speak. He was so shocked with what had happened. And you know, that was the last time that Robin ever spoke. And he flew down to the door, and the door was opened. And there came the Swan, the lady of the lake. And behind her was another swan, a male swan. And they walked together down to the Broad. And they got on to the Broad. And that, it is said, they were there for a very long time, because swans mate for life. And who knows, maybe on one of the Broads at Horning or at How Hill, one of those swans that you see there may be the descendant of the swan that was a hunchback.
I saw 8 magpies sitting in a tree. 2 for you and 6 for me. 1 for sorrow, 2 for mirth, 3 for a wedding, 4 for a birth. 5 for England, 6 for France, 7 for a fiddler, and 8 for a dance. So I can hear the birds here, and I can hear the chattering of the magpies. The magpies gathering, the tribe, the tittering of magpies, the gulp of magpies, and my favourite and the most popular, the mischief of magpies. Now, of all the birds that you'll find in woods like these, the magpie is probably the one that's got the most superstition and folklore attached to it. And magpies get a really bad press. You know, this is why we have all these superstitions around magpies. I can remember, for as long as I can remember, that I've always blown a kiss to a magpie or said, "Hello, Mr. Magpie," if I've seen a lone magpie. And apparently the correct greeting, if you see a lone magpie, is to say, "Hello, Mr. Magpie, how's Mrs. Magpie and all the little magpies?" And then if you just want to be doubly sure that you're going to protect yourself from any bad luck of a magpie-related nature, you can spit 3 times over your shoulder and then flap your arms, thus making a second magpie. So then there's only 2. There's 2 magpies then. So I wonder why it is that magpies have such a bad press and why they've got such a bad reputation. So it could be stories that go back a long way. So there is a story about how the magpie was the only one that didn't mourn when Jesus was crucified. But I'm not going to tell that story, not today. And there's another story about how when Noah built his ark and all the animals were invited to go onto the ark, that the magpie was the only animal that didn't go in. Instead, the magpie sat on top of the ark, swearing as the world drowned. I'm not going to do that either. The magpie, the maggot pie, Margaret pie, and actually one of my favourites, chatter pie, which is a word that's used both down in Somerset, where I come from, and in Norfolk, my adopted home. And of course, magpies have got a bit of a reputation for being thieves. But actually, that's not even true either. In fact, there are some scientists down at Exeter University who have proven, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that magpies aren't thieves. Of all the birds, magpies are actually some of the most intelligent, and it's considered that actually the magpies are quite as intelligent almost as dolphins and apes. And one of the things that they're particularly good at is nest building. In fact, one day, the magpie very kindly decided that he would impart some of his wisdom and skill of nest building with some of the other birds in the forest. And so they all gathered round, and the magpie began his lesson. First of all, by making a sort of cake out of mud. And the thrush, seeing this, went, "Oh, right, that's how it's done." And then off she flew. And to this very day, that is how the thrush builds her nest. But there was more to come, because now the magpie got some sticks and put them into the mud. And the blackbird, who was watching this, went, "Aha, so this is how you build a nest." And off he flew to build his nest, and has still built his nest in the very same way to this very day. But more work was to be done on this nest. And so the magpie went and got some more mud and patted it around the mud that was already there and the sticks. And the owl, who was watching this, as he nodded wisely and said, "Oh yes, I see how it's done." And off the owl flew to build his nest. But of course there was more to come, and now there were twigs that were woven and entwined around the outside and through the sticks and the mud. And the sparrow, watching this, said, "Ah, yes, now I see how it's done." And then, of course, she flew off, and that is how she built her nest. But now the magpie gathered dried leaves and feathers and packed them around the sticks and the twigs and the mud. And the starling, now watching this, goes, "Ah, yes, now I see how a nest is made." And off the starling flew and built her nest in that way, and still to this very day has done the same. Well, by now most of the birds had flown off to build their nests, all except for the turtle dove. But the turtle dove wasn't really paying attention, was actually looking around at something else that was going on. And as the magpie laid one more stick over the nest, the turtle dove was wittering away to himself, going, "Take two more, Taffy, two more, two. "Oh, you're not listening, you're not paying attention," said the frustrated magpie. And so frustrated he was that he flapped his wings and he flew off into the sky and never bothered to teach any of those birds again how to make their nests. And so it is to this day that this is why the birds build their nests in so many different ways. 1 for sorrow, 2 for joy, 3 for a girl, 4 for a boy, 5 for silver, 6 for gold, 7 for a secret never to be told.
So some of my work in life, I work in the woods with people, and sometimes I work with children, sometimes I work with adults. And this is a real story when I was working with some children actually, and it was before the children had arrived in the wood. And I previously had some training to track animals for pleasure, you know, to photograph or to watch, and I use those skills quite often when I go into a wood. And one of the things that I learned is when you enter a wood is to become very still and stop. Basically, and stop for a good 5 minutes, if not longer, because it slows your heart rate down, it slows your excitement down, and then you begin to hear things in the wood. You might smell things, you might begin to see things, and you do literally begin to come one with the wood. Actually, you have to practice it, but you do start to connect with the wood. And I did this one morning, and I did it in a place where, and I went to a place rather very quietly, where I knew there was deer tracks through the wood, and we know there's badgers in there as well. and lots of birds and what have we. And I got down on my hands and knees, and I was literally crawling along the deer track. You know, I could see their prints in the mud, and I was crawling along, and using trees to sort of mask me and bushes. It was all part of the technique to track and to get close. And I suddenly heard a pheasant call to my right-hand side, and then it just stopped, which is really unusual because a pheasant, if it's startled, it makes a noise and then it flies off. But it stayed still, so I knew something was happening, but it was so quick I had no idea what was happening. And then I saw in the distance about 6 or 8 deer, and they were foraging, eating. And normally what happens is some of them will eat, and there'll be 1 or 2 at least who are looking and listening with their big old ears. They're listening and looking to protect the others. And I was in such a place, and I was relatively close, and they didn't know I was there because I'd been very stealth. And then everything went completely quiet, and I sensed it, and I just thought, oh, what's happening? Because I could still see the pheasant, I could still see the deer, but there was just a silence of everything. And then I got to see what it was. A fox was coming down the track towards me, and I was hid, so it couldn't see me, but it sensed me because it stopped. And it was looking, and I was looking through some branches of a bush, and I like to think we actually made eye contact. But I certainly made eye contact with the fox, but I'm not sure if it did with me, but I certainly could see it. And it just kind of, and there was this moment for 1 or 2 seconds where the world stopped. Everything stopped. And it's so hard to put into words what that is. It's very magical. I've experienced it 2 or 3 times in my life where it feels like the whole world and everything stops. And it's just unreal, actually. And then the fox just went off to one side and just trotted off. The pheasant, and then I heard the noise of the other animals. Shane, where are you? And all the children came into the wood, and all the animals just went, and they were gone. And then I sat them down before we started the day and told them the story that I've just told you. And they were fascinated and had lots of questions. And that's a real life story that I experienced by being out in the wood for a while and being quiet in the wood for a while. Yeah, it will come to you if you can sit still and be quiet for more than 5 minutes, which is hard for us humans quite often. But if you can, things will begin to come to you.
Listen, listen, listen. Do you hear the birds singing? Do you hear the trees growing? Did you know that every bird and every tree knows our stories? Here's our stories. In this forest, there is a story that they know, a story that I would like to tell you. For long ago there was a king. He was a good man. He lived here. He was the father to this forest, the father to that land, a father to his people, and a father to his 2 sons, who he adored. One day, when he was old, he went to see them, sat them down before him and said, "You know, soon I will die. And there is one thing I need to know before I do. I need to know that you will look after one another." And the youngest son looked at his father and said, "My father, of course we will look after one another." But the eldest son, he looked at his father and said, "Oh, do not worry, my father. All will be well." When the old king died and the eldest son took to the throne, that very evening he said to his younger brother, the prince, "I want you to go down into the kitchen. I want you to see what the chef is cooking." When he came back and told him, he said, "Oh, that is good. I'm looking forward to that food then." And when they sat at the table at the end of the meal, he said, "You know, that was a good food, but I know you could do better. Really? Said his brother. Yes, I know you could do well, because our father was always saying what a good chef you are. I've made my first royal decision. Oh, what is that, brother? I want you to be the chef of the household. Oh, it will be an honor, my brother, he said. And so it was. He became the chef to the royal household, and for many weeks he cooked fine food, until one evening his brother the king said to him, "Come here. I want something else to discuss with you." "What is that?" he said. "I have noticed that the household is not quite kept the way it should be. You know, father said that you were very neat and tidy." "Well, I do my best," said the prince. "Well, I have decided to make my second royal decision." "And what is that?" "I've decided that you should become the head of the household service." "Oh, as well as the chef, of course," said the king. "Well, very well, brother. It will be an honor." So now he had two tasks. He had to work long hours, but he didn't mind. He wanted to be a help to his brother, who was the king and had so much to do, didn't he? And the weeks went on, and the weeks went on, and the king watched his brother. Till one evening he called him and said, come here. I have a third decision that I am going to make." "What is that, brother?" "Your Majesty." "Look out of the window," said the king. So the prince looked out the window. "What do you see?" "Well, I see the royal gardens." "And what do you think about the royal gardens?" "Well, they are very beautiful. Our father loved the gardens, like he loved many things." "Yes," said the king, "but they're very untidy. I mean, look at the head gardener. Look how he goes up those steps. He is old." "I've made my third decision, brother. I've decided that you shall become the head gardener." "Oh," said the prince, "I see. And I want you to carry on being the chef and the head of the household as well." Well, he did his best to do the three tasks: cooking and cleaning and tidying and gardening. Hour after hour, he became exhausted, hardly had any time to sleep. He became thin. He lost his appetite. He didn't know what to do. And one night he lay in his bed and he thought, enough. This is enough. I can't do this. I can't do any of these things anymore. I must leave. So he left. In the dead of night, he left that place. He left the palace, went through the gardens, and he went into the forest. And in the dark, he lay down between two trees and fell asleep. When the first morning light came, he saw those true trees for what they were: an oak, a holly, kings of the forest. This is what his father had taught him. And then over there he saw an elder, silver birches. He did not know this forest, not this part of it anyway. And as he sat there, suddenly he saw something flying towards him, a little blue-feathered bird. Blue feathers on its head and its back and its tail as well. The bird sat on a little branch in the holly tree and looked at him the way birds do sometimes, cocking its head this way and that. And then it flew away, and he watched it go. And then the prince saw the bird coming back. Only this time it seemed to have something in its beak, a little red berry. And it lay down at its feet, the berry, and the prince looked at it. And then the bird flew away. A little later it came back with another berry, only this one was yellow, and it lay that down at his feet as well. And the bird looked up at him and started singing, but he didn't understand what it was saying, if it was saying anything at all. And then the bird flew away again. It came back with another berry and lay it down at his feet. This one was as blue as the midnight sky. "Well, what do you want me to do with those?" And the bird looked at him and sang, "I don't know what you're trying to say." The bird flew away, came back again with the red and the yellow and the berry as blue as the midnight sky. "I see," he said. "So you want me to eat? How do you know I'm hungry? How strange." So it was that the prince reached down and took that berry as blue as the midnight sky, and It was so sweet. And so he took the other one as well, and then he tried a red one, and that was so tasty, and the yellow one had so many different tastes. So the blue bird flew away and came back with more of the berries. That afternoon, the young prince began to build a fire, for was his father not so wise to teach his son how to build a fire? The little blue feather bird saw what the prince had done and flew away. Where are you going now? It went down to its river and caught a fish and came back with a fish in its beak. Oh, my father taught me what to do with that. And at once the young prince got some stones and put them into the fire to heat them. And then he got a stick, a bit like this one, and he began to dig and dig and dig a hole. And when those stones were hot enough, he put those stones into the hole. And by now he'd got some silver birch bark, and he wrapped that birch bark around the fish and put the fish into the hole and covered it with earth. And when he came back hours later, the fish was cooked, and he sat there almost in the dark with the little bird, watching him eat. So there was the evening, sitting in front of a beautiful fire, when the prince looked around, and he saw so many creatures coming out of the dark. Why, there was a bee, a moth, and a wasp. And then when he looked down, he saw a mouse and a shrew, and then a squirrel. Oh my goodness, there was a stag, and a deer, and an otter. And there, coming over the hill, there came a fox, and behind it came hare. And over there was badger and mole and all the other scribblings and scrabblings that dig underneath the ground. And then he realized, coming from the tree, there came an owl, tawny owl, and then a barn owl, and then a buzzard. And then there was a rook and a crow, and there was blackbird, and there was thrush, and there was robin, and a dunnock, and of course there was his little advisor, and there were all the different birds coming there and singing and bringing their own food, all of these creatures gathering around the fire, around him, and eating. And as they were eating, they began to sing and to talk. The prince realized something very strange. As they were singing and talking, he could understand what they were saying. It wasn't because they were using his language. It was now because he understood their language. The highs and the lows. They would look at him and go back to their food and sing again, and he understood it all. And the little advisor said, "Yes, yes, Prince. Now you know you are one of us. This is your home. You will be here in this forest for as long as you need. This is your home." And the prince looked around and knew that was true. And the days and the weeks and the months went by. He did not think of the kingdom anymore. He did not think of his brother the king. They were better off without him. This was his home. But then, one afternoon, he saw something coming through the forest. Why, it was his advisor. He looked worried, and the little bird came and landed in a branch and said, "I have a terrible news for you, terrible news." "What is it?" "Well, tell me what the news is." "Across this land, across this kingdom has come a plague, a terrible fever. People are dying," said the little advisor. "And your brother the king has the fever too. He will die unless you do something." "What can I do?" "Well," said the advisor, "in the middle of the forest there is a magical tree. We call it the fever tree." "Then take me there," said the prince. "Take me there right away." And so he ran and followed the little advisor as it flew, all the way into the deepest, darkest part of that forest. And when they got there, oh, what a tree it was. He had never seen such a tree. "Gather as many leaves as you can," said the advisor. "Let us go quickly." And so he did, and he began running and running, chasing after the flying advisor. And as he was going, he noticed the creatures that he knew so well now, coming out from underneath the trees. They were offering him roots and leaves and oil from the forest itself. Take this, one would say. This is the root of a dandelion. Take this. This is the leaf of a nettle. This is the oil of another. This is the oil of the primrose. And on it went until he got to the palace. And they went all the way down to the stairs and all the way into the kitchen. And when they got into the kitchen, he opened up a drawer and he took out the root of ginger. And he said, bring me a pestle and a mortar quickly. A pestle and a mortar was brought for him. He put all the ingredients into the mortar. He got that pestle and he began to grind them together. And then he asked for the water of the silver birch. I can mix this all together. And he did. And when it was done, he left the kitchen with the advisor, and they went up the stairs and they went along the corridor. And there, at the end of the corridor, were all these people from the royal household around the doorway of the bedchamber of the king. Move aside, he said. I need to see the king. I need to save his life. And they looked around at him, and one of them said, you're too late. Your Majesty, you're too late. I will not be too late. Move aside. And so they did. And he went into the bedchamber. And there, around the bed, were all the doctors, the physicians, and the advisors to the king. And he said, move aside. I need to see my brother. I need to save his life. And they said, you are too late. He is going to die. I am not too late. I have this medicine for him. Move aside. And so they did. And the prince sat on the bed. Brother, he said, I will not let you die. But the brother did not respond. So the prince put his hand into the mortar and took out a little bit of the mixture, the medicine, and put it on the lips of the king. But the king still did not respond. You must swallow. He still did not respond. Bring me some water from the silver birch. It was brought in a flask. He put some of that liquid into the mouth of the king. Swallow, my brother, swallow. And he swallowed. Now eat. But still he did not eat. Let me give you some more. And he gave him some more of the medicine. And then he saw his brother begin to swallow. He gave him more and more until the king opened his eyes and looked at his brother. Oh, what a sight you are. I thought you had died. I sent out messengers all over our kingdom and could not find you. I am ashamed of what I did. Be quiet, brother. I do not want to hear this, but I did so many bad things. I do not want to hear. It does not matter to me. All that matters is that you are my brother, you are the king, and you must live. The king was sat up, and there he looked at his brother. You are so wise, he said, so clever. Advise me. He said, I will tell you one thing, my brother. Look at the end of your bed. Do you see the little bird there with the blue feathers? Yes, said the king. Well, that is my advisor. That is what I have been doing all this time. I have learned so much from him and all the animals and the creatures that live in the forest. I have a royal decision to make, said the king. I have decided that you and I, my brother, shall rule this kingdom together. Do you agree? And the prince laughed. Of course. I have a feeling, you know, that was what our father always wanted. So let us be kings together. And so they were. And they ruled that land. They looked after that land, this forest, those people, the rivers, and all that lived there. And they say that there was a wooden crest made with 2 crowns on it for that kingdom. And in the middle of those 2 crowns was carved a little bird, the advisor to the kings. And that is my story that came from this forest. And now I share it with you. Blessings.